We're going to have a look at today's headlines. Nick Ferrari joins us from his studio in town, and Baroness Sayeeda Warsi is here in the studio. Good morning to both of you. Nick, we're going to start with the Chancellor. I wonder if you've got to the bottom of what was the point of what she said earlier.
You've nailed it, actually, because what we have been looking at, the reaction, it doesn't really matter what I think. Let's look where the markets are. The pound relatively untouched. FTSE 100 down 1.0%. Gilts up just a touch. That talks about government borrowing. What does that tell us, Ben? That tells us that the experts, the money men and women, have really not taken anything from that. There are promises of growth that there have been for some time. Everybody knows how constrained she is, how constricted she is. We obviously took the press conference on LBC and then we listened to the journalist questions. We came out after about 4 or 5 questions. Every single journalist rightly saying, does this mean that your promises from the election manifesto, the number of promises you've subsequently given that taxes will not go up, can you actually say that they're going to? I'm not going to give you my budget today. That has to wait for November the 26th. So pretty much what we expected. She talked about stronger foundations. There wasn't really a lot of meat on the bone. And Sayeeda will remember, and there we are saying it was stronger foundations she talked about there, doesn't she? Sayeeda will remember the days gone by when budgets were almost like holy writ. They were so secretive that you would have a picture on the Sunday of the newspapers the week before with perhaps the Chancellor, and by the way, it was always a man, in a pub, and he'd have a pint in his hand, and I'm staying tight-lipped about this budget. They were under lock and key. Sayeeda probably was involved in that directly. Now we have pre-budgets, we have pre-budgets. We're now having a sort of budget warning without any policies. It's a very, very strange change in tack.
We've got a couple of weeks till we actually hear what the budget's going to be, Sayeeda, and everybody was sort of gripped this morning. It was breakfast television. I know they took it like you would have, Nick, on your show on Good Morning Britain. There was 20-odd minutes of it with her not really saying anything at all at a key part of the morning when there's all sorts of things happening. What was the point?
It was a strategic rolling of the pitch. It was a way of saying, I'm going to make some really tough decisions. I'm going to make some decisions which are completely contrary to what we said we were going to do. And therefore, I'm going to tell you about that now, so it feels like less of a blow in about 4 weeks' time when I actually announce the budget. Anything that she said could have been said practically by any Chancellor over the last kind of 20 years. And that's Labour, Coalition, Conservative. That speech could have been made practically by any Chancellor. I think what really concerned me was that there was also I think she probably tried to set out what Labour stand for, but much of that she spent kind of attributing blame, talking about how other people had done it wrong, talking about how other people would do it wrong. And I just think that the economy is in a much more serious place than that. So in many ways, what she could have done, which was a bit of a State of Nations speech to the country to say this is how tough things are, this is what she didn't even manage to do that. I listened to it in full and I just came away saying, well, so what? What was the point of that? And what is she trying to do other than saying this is really serious, we've got to stop being political? And yet I think it was all political in the way in which she did this in a very strategic move.
Well, a couple of the phrases, Nick. She says, we will all have to contribute. She will do what is right, not what is popular. But I think it was Beth Rigby that asked the first question, which was, and you've already pointed this out, in their manifesto pledges, they said that they wouldn't increase income tax. They made these vows to the British public, which, as Beth Rigby pointed out, so people went to the polls and voted for them off the back of those vows. We are a year into their administration. And it sounds very much like, as Sayeeda described, she's rolling the pitch because they're going to actually backtrack on those vows.
Yes, and we had various rationale for that. And Beth Rigby asked, and Chris Mason from the BBC, Robert Peston. In fact, Chris Mason even waved the manifesto talking about this. And, of course, she said, I'm not going to give you the actual budget line. But what an interesting point we picked up on. And I mean, Sayeeda will remember this. We came into this last election. Do you remember that everything was fully costed and fully funded? And yet today we hear that it's not their fault. It's the fault of Liz Truss's, her words, not mine, Liz Truss's disastrous mini-budget. It was the fault of an underprepared country for COVID. It was the fault of a badly executed Brexit. It was the fault of 14 years of conservative. I mean, it's Guy Fawkes tomorrow. Is she also going to be Guy Fawkes not blowing up Parliament? It would seem quite incredible. We didn't go that far back.
Yeah, well, yeah, as you say, how long have we got? Is it, Sayeeda, you say 4 weeks?
Yeah, 26th of November, is it, the
26th
budget?
of November.
And I think what's really
26th.
concerning is, look, I come from a family of business. I spent a lot of my time in the business world. And there was she talked a lot about productivity, but there was no acknowledgement of what the last Labour budget did to productivity in this country. There was no acknowledgement of what it did to business. There was no acknowledgement of how it actually stifled investment, how it actually stopped recruitment. And I think if she was going to have I'm going to be really honest with the country, which is what she said she was saying, she should also have acknowledged how actually many of the problems that we're seeing now are, of course, built up over many years of various governments, including, I would say, the government that I was a part of. But she needs to also be honest enough to acknowledge the problems that have been created since they've been in government and the budgets and the decisions that they've made. And that, I thought, was a shortcoming.
Well, it's clear that the economy's in trouble, but also the property market seems to be in trouble too. New research suggests that the concept of owning a forever home could become a thing of the past for younger generations, as 63% no longer think it's important. Do you think they don't think it's important, or do you feel that the younger generations perhaps feel it's unattainable, Sayeeda?
I think there are so many bits to this, right? I think there's a north-south divide.
Right.
I think if I speak to lots of young people in the north, they're more likely to want to put down roots and kind of feel like they want to buy a home.
Yeah.
I think in some places around the country where maybe your job or your lifestyle is much more transitional and fluid, you're not likely to want to put down roots very early on. I think the second part is they just can't afford to buy a house until much, much later in life, and therefore there's no point in them trying to look for their forever home. And I also think that we've got to a point in this country where, unlike most of Europe, we honestly see our homes as this kind of investment. Whereas I think in a lot of places in Europe, they just kind of see it as somewhere to live for now, and then kind of maybe it's not something that has to produce them an income and an investment, and is something that they can pass on. So I think our approach to kind of homes has been different. And I'm not sure that that is somehow the way in which younger people have benefited, because they're now saying, well, I can't afford to buy my house. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to pay off my mortgage. Actually, I just need to be able to live somewhere at a time. And then job security. Are we actually in jobs where we can say, I'm going to be in this job for the next 20 years, and therefore I can actually sign up to a 25, 30-year mortgage and continue to pay it?
Nick, do you think it's also that perhaps younger generations are putting more emphasis on life experiences as well, and maybe choosing to spend their money in that direction?
I think probably all of us around the table would agree that something as momentous as this, you're guided a lot by what your parent or your parents did. Yeah. And my late father came out of the army in the Second World War, and to own his own property was a dream, and my mum was obviously the same. So that's what I learned. And I remember my father saying, look, if you spend money on rent, it's dead money. You should be spending money on a mortgage. But it's worth noting, just as Sayeeda quite rightly has taken us up north, I'll keep us down in the south, in London and that sort of surrounding area. I mean, in some areas, and I'm not talking Mayfair or opposite the Ritz Hotel, you're spending £300,000 on a one-bedroom flat in some areas. Well, you have to get the deposit for that, which is, to use your word, Kat, that is unattainable for a lot of people. So I don't think that, and by the way, this is what's incredible. Sayeeda's probably roughly the same age. We were going through interest rates. We're like 14% was on our mortgage. And now we think ourselves, genuinely, I think ourselves lucky because I did it and I paid the 14%, but the deposit that I had to find was so much less. So wind the clock on now from when I bought my first house. It is, your word, it is unattainable for most kids, particularly in London and that southeast area. That is the reality. They want it. They possibly see their dads or their older uncles or whatever. Wow, they've got a house. They just can't get there. That's the truth.
No, it's a dream that's simply unachievable.
It's the comparison between the cost of a house and the cost of your first salary. And my first home was twice my annual salary. And when I say that to my kids, it kind of blows their mind.
Wow. It does,
You know, when they have this whole kind of... And if you think about where salaries are now, where, we started our initial kind of jobs in the early 20s, and people are still starting in the north, in many places in their early 20s, 22, 24, 26,000 is a starting salary, but you're not going to find a house as we could then, when my first house, I think, was about 48,000. So you're not going to find houses of that price. And, my kids often joke about it and say, you were the generation that could turn up and buy a house for 2 bags of peanuts and a shilling. They do genuinely feel like this is so out of their range. But I also think that people feel that sense of putting down roots. They connect to that in a very different way. We were desperate to get on the housing ladder, put down our roots. This was going to be our home. Our kids often talk about not knowing where they're going to end up, not even in talking about parts around the United Kingdom, parts around the world.
Yes.
They talk about the world being where they could potentially go and work. So why would they tie themselves down?
It's a really good point. It's a really, really good point.
Absolutely.
Thank you both for joining us. Nick, you're going to come and join us in the studio shortly because we will be discussing, when Nick and Sayeeda are together, People Magazine's Sexiest Man Alive. There is a correlation.
Were you in the running?
Well, there's a correlation that we are waiting for Nick to be in the studio to celebrate that.
Look, it was James Bond the other week. Will you stop having sport with this clapped-out old bloke? It's too much. Leave me alone.
We will be discussing the person who's taken that title a little bit later on. For the time being, though, Nick, Sayeeda, thank you.
Hello.
Thanks for visiting our This Morning YouTube channel. We upload tons of new content every single day. So hit the subscribe button, like all the videos, and don't miss out. We'll see you in the morning.